Emily Carter had always believed her life would follow a simple path. She was born in a quiet western town, surrounded by endless fields, dusty roads, and wide skies that seemed to stretch forever. The town was small enough that everyone knew each other's names, families, and stories. For most people there, life rarely changed. But Emily had always dreamed of something more. At 19, she was full of ambition and curiosity about the world beyond the valley. She loved reading books about distant cities and imagined herself one day leaving the small town behind to study and build a life on her own terms. However, dreams often collided with reality. Her family's ranch had once been one of the most respected properties in the valley. When Emily was a child, the land was full of cattle, healthy crops, and the cheerful noise of workers moving through the fields. But the last few years had been harsh. Severe drought had struck the region more than once. The soil had grown dry and unforgiving. Crops failed repeatedly, and many ranchers in the valley struggled to survive. Emily's father fought desperately to keep their ranch alive. He worked from sunrise to midnight nearly every day, repairing fences, selling equipment, and cutting costs wherever possible. Yet the debts continued to grow. The bank had given him warnings. Then they gave him deadlines. Finally, one cold autumn evening, Emily overheard something that would change her life forever. She was inside the house preparing dinner when she heard unfamiliar voices coming from the front porch. Curious, she moved closer to the door. Through the window she saw a tall man standing across from her father. She recognized him instantly. Daniel Hayes. Every person in the valley knew that name. Daniel Hayes was the wealthiest ranch owner for hundreds of miles. His ranch spread across hills and valleys like a small kingdom. Thousands of cattle grazed on his land, and his barns were said to be larger than most farms in the county. But wealth wasn't the only thing that made him famous. Daniel Hayes was also known for being mysterious. He rarely appeared in town. When he did, people noticed the quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. He spoke little, but his presence commanded attention. Some people admired him, others believed he was cold and distant. But no one denied his power. Emily's father looked exhausted as he spoke with him. "I've tried everything," her father said, his voice heavy with defeat. "The bank will take the ranch next month." Daniel listened quietly. After a moment he spoke in a calm voice. "There may be another option." Emily leaned closer to the door, her curiosity growing. Her father looked confused. "What kind of option?" Daniel paused before answering. "Let your daughter marry me." The words struck Emily like lightning. Her heart pounded. Her father stared at him in shock. "You can't be serious," he said. Daniel remained calm. "If she agrees, I'll pay every debt on this ranch." Emily stepped outside before she could stop herself. "You're talking about me," she said firmly. Both men turned toward her. Her father looked uncomfortable. "Emily, we were just discussing possibilities." She crossed her arms. "You're discussing my life." Her gaze shifted toward Daniel. He studied her quietly. Up close, she noticed that he looked older than she had imagined, perhaps early 30s. His face was strong and serious, but his eyes held a thoughtful calmness. "You don't even know me," she said. Daniel nodded slightly. "That's true." "Then why would you marry me?" He didn't answer immediately. Finally he said, "Because it solves both our problems." Emily frowned. "What problem of yours?" Daniel simply replied, "Loneliness." The answer surprised her, but it didn't make the situation easier. Over the next several days, Emily argued endlessly with her father. "How can you expect me to do this?" she asked one night. Her father sat at the kitchen table, looking older than she had ever seen him. "If we lose the ranch," he said quietly, "we lose everything your mother and I built." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. "You're asking me to give up my future. I'm asking you to save our family." The weight of his words crushed her. Emily walked outside into the cool night air. The ranch stretched before her under the moonlight. This land held every memory of her childhood, running through fields, learning to ride horses, helping her mother in the garden. If the bank took it, those memories would vanish. Days passed. Emily searched desperately for another solution, but there was none. Finally, with a heavy heart, she gave her answer. She agreed. The news spread through the town faster than wildfire. Everyone had something to say. Marrying a millionaire at 19. Others whispered darker thoughts. That man is strange, someone muttered at the general store. No young girl should be forced into marriage. But the arrangements moved forward quickly. Daniel Hayes handled everything with quiet efficiency. Within a week, the wedding was scheduled. The small wooden church in town was decorated with flowers and ribbons. Emily stood alone in the dressing room behind the church, staring at herself in the mirror. She wore a white dress her mother had carefully sewn. It was beautiful. But she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like someone walking toward an unknown future. A soft knock came at the door. Her father stepped inside. His expression was full of regret. "I never wanted this for you," he said. Emily sighed. "I know." For a moment neither of them spoke. Finally her father whispered, "Thank you." Emily nodded slowly. Soon the church bells began to ring. The ceremony was about to begin. Outside, nearly the entire town had gathered. People whispered among themselves, curious about the unusual marriage. When the doors opened, Emily stepped forward. The church grew silent. Daniel Hayes stood at the altar waiting. He wore a dark suit instead of his usual cowboy clothing. His posture was straight and calm. When Emily began walking down the aisle, every eye followed her. Her heart pounded with uncertainty. Step by step, she approached the man who was about to become her husband. Daniel's eyes softened slightly when she reached the front. The pastor began the ceremony. Emily barely heard the words. Her thoughts raced with questions. What kind of life awaited her on his enormous ranch? What kind of man had she just married? And why had he truly chosen her? The vows were exchanged quickly. Daniel spoke first. "I promise to respect you and protect you," he said quietly. Emily repeated her vows, though her voice trembled slightly. Moments later, the ceremony was complete. The pastor announced them as husband and wife. The crowd applauded politely, though many still whispered among themselves. No one realized yet that something far more surprising was about to happen. Because Daniel Hayes had prepared a wedding gift. A gift that would soon leave the entire town speechless. After the wedding ceremony ended, the townspeople slowly began leaving the churchyard. Some offered polite congratulations, while others simply watched from a distance, whispering quietly among themselves. Emily barely noticed any of them. Her mind was filled with uncertainty about what would happen next. She had just married the richest man in the valley, a man she still barely understood. Daniel Hayes stood beside her calmly, shaking hands with a few local ranchers who had come to witness the ceremony. His behavior was polite but reserved, as if he preferred not to draw attention to himself. When the last of the guests began drifting away, Daniel turned toward Emily. "We should head to the ranch," he said gently. Emily nodded. Outside the church, a black horse-drawn carriage waited near the dusty road. It was simple but well built, the kind often used by ranch owners traveling between distant properties. Daniel opened the carriage door for her. Emily stepped inside, smoothing the folds of her wedding dress as she sat down. Daniel climbed in across from her, and moments later, the carriage began moving down the quiet road leading out of town. For a while, neither of them spoke. Emily watched the town slowly disappear behind them. The small buildings, the general store, the church, everything she had known since childhood, grew smaller in the distance. A strange feeling filled her chest. She wasn't just leaving town. She was leaving the life she had always known. After several minutes of silence, Daniel spoke. "You're probably wondering what life will be like at the ranch." Emily gave a small, uncertain smile. "That thought has crossed my mind." Daniel looked out the window toward the wide valley. "My ranch is large," he said simply, much larger than most people realize. Emily had heard rumors about it for years. Some said it covered more than 10,000 acres. Others claimed it stretched across entire hillsides and valleys. "How many people work there?" she asked. "About 40 during the busy seasons," Daniel replied. "Fewer in winter." Emily nodded quietly. She wondered what those workers would think when they learned that their employer had suddenly brought home a 19-year-old wife. The carriage continued moving along the dusty road for nearly an hour. Gradually, the scenery began to change. Instead of small farms and scattered houses, the land opened into wide grazing fields. Herds of cattle could be seen in the distance, moving slowly across the hills like dark waves against the golden grass. Finally, Emily spotted something ahead. A massive ranch house stood on a gentle hill, overlooking the valley. It was larger than any home she had ever seen. Long wooden barns stretched behind it, and fences spread across the land in every direction. Workers could be seen guiding cattle through wide gates, while horses moved gracefully through open fields. Emily stared in amazement. "This all belongs to you?" she asked. Daniel followed her gaze. "Yes," he said. The carriage rolled through a large wooden gate marked with the Hayes Ranch symbol. As they approached the main house, several ranch workers stopped what they were doing to watch the carriage arrive. Emily felt her nervousness return. When the carriage stopped, Daniel stepped down and helped her out. The workers gathered nearby, curious but respectful. One older ranch hand tipped his hat. "Welcome home, Mr. Hayes," he said. Daniel nodded politely. "Thank you, Tom." The man's eyes shifted briefly toward Emily. "And this must be Mrs. Hayes," he said. Emily felt a little awkward hearing those words. Daniel spoke calmly. "This is Emily. She'll be living here from now on." The workers greeted her politely, though Emily could sense their curiosity. After all, Daniel Hayes had lived alone for years. No one expected him to suddenly bring home a young bride. Inside the ranch house, Emily was even more surprised. The interior was beautiful, but not overly fancy. Wooden beams crossed the ceiling, large windows allowed sunlight to fill the rooms, and a stone fireplace stood in the center of the living room. Despite the size of the house, it felt warm and welcoming. "I thought it might feel too large for you," Daniel said quietly as she looked around. Emily turned toward him. "Actually, it feels peaceful." Daniel seemed pleased by that answer. A housekeeper soon appeared from the kitchen. "Mr. Hayes," she said warmly, "congratulations." Daniel smiled slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins." He introduced Emily to her. Mrs. Collins had worked at the ranch for nearly 15 years and managed the house, while Daniel spent most of his time overseeing ranch operations. Over the next hour, Emily was shown around the house. There were several bedrooms, a large dining room, and a quiet study filled with books. Emily paused when she saw the study. "You read a lot?" she asked Daniel. "Whenever I have time," he replied. That answer surprised her. She had expected the Millionaire Cowboy to be focused only on cattle and business. But the shelves held books about history, science, and even poetry. It was the first sign that Daniel Hayes might be more complex than the town believed. Later that afternoon, Emily walked outside to explore the property. The air smelled of fresh grass and horses. In the distance, she watched ranch workers guiding cattle across the valley, while others repaired fences along the hillside. Daniel joined her near the wooden porch. "Most of the ranch runs itself," he explained. "The workers here are good people." Emily nodded slowly. "You've built something impressive." Daniel looked across the land quietly. "It took many years." Emily hesitated before asking her next question. "Why did you really choose me?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "Because I saw someone strong." Emily frowned slightly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." Daniel shook his head. "I know enough." Emily studied him carefully. The more time she spent around him, the more she realized something important. Daniel Hayes wasn't the cold, distant man the town believed him to be. He was quiet, thoughtful, and surprisingly considerate. That evening they ate dinner together in the large dining room. The meal was simple but delicious. During dinner, Daniel spoke about the ranch, explaining how the cattle were managed and how the land had been developed over the years. Emily listened with growing curiosity. For the first time since the wedding, she felt a small sense of calm. Maybe this life wouldn't be as frightening as she had imagined. After dinner, they walked outside together under the evening sky. The valley stretched endlessly beneath the fading sunlight. "It's beautiful here," Emily said softly. Daniel nodded. "That's why I built my life here." They stood quietly for a moment. Emily realized something she hadn't expected. Daniel Hayes had treated her with kindness and respect since the moment she arrived. He hadn't tried to control her or demand anything from her. That confused her even more. Because if he hadn't married her to control her family's ranch, then what had truly motivated him? Emily didn't know yet, but she would soon discover the answer. Because the next morning, Daniel planned to give her something, a wedding gift. And when the town learned what it was, no one would be able to believe it. Emily woke early the next morning to the sound of distant cattle and the soft rustling of wind across the valley. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then, she remembered. She was no longer living at her father's small ranch. She was now the wife of Daniel Hayes, the richest rancher in the entire valley. The thought still felt strange. Sunlight streamed through the large window of the bedroom Daniel had given her. The room was simple but beautiful, with wooden furniture and a view that stretched across miles of open land. Emily stepped outside onto the balcony. Below her, the ranch was already alive with activity. Cowboys guided cattle through the fields. Horses ran along the fences, and the smell of fresh hay drifted through the morning air. Daniel Hayes stood near the main barn, speaking with several ranch hands. Even from a distance, Emily noticed how naturally he fit into this environment. The workers respected him, but there was also something else in their attitude. Trust. Daniel wasn't just their employer, he was their leader. A few minutes later, he noticed Emily watching from the balcony and gave her a small nod. She smiled back. Soon she joined him outside, near the barn. "Good morning," Daniel said calmly. "Good morning," Emily replied. "You sleep well?" She nodded. "It's quiet here, peaceful." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's why I prefer the ranch over the town." They walked together along the dirt path between the barns. Emily noticed workers greeting Daniel with friendly respect. Some tipped their hats politely to her, as well. "You've built a strong community here," she said. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Good land attracts good people." They continued walking until they reached a wide hill overlooking the entire ranch. Emily stopped and stared at the view. The property stretched as far as she could see, rolling green fields, grazing cattle, and distant barns standing proudly against the horizon. "It's incredible," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "There's something I wanted to give you." Emily turned toward him. "A gift?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. Emily accepted it carefully. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it," he said. She slowly broke the seal. Inside were several official-looking documents. At first she didn't understand what she was reading, but then her eyes widened. These are property papers," she said. Daniel nodded. Emily continued reading. The documents clearly stated that half of the Hayes Ranch had been transferred into her name. Her hands began to tremble. "This can't be real," she whispered. Daniel's voice remained calm. "It is." Emily looked up at him in shock. "You're giving me half of your ranch?" "Yes. That's worth millions." Daniel nodded again. Emily struggled to understand. "Why would you do that?" Daniel looked out across the valley before answering. "Because I never wanted you to feel trapped in this marriage." Emily stared at him. "What do you mean?" Daniel spoke quietly but clearly. "You agreed to marry me to save your family's ranch." "I know," That wasn't your choice. Emily's chest tightened. So this, Daniel continued, gives you a choice. He gestured toward the documents in her hands. With that land, you could leave tomorrow and still build any future you want. Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. You're giving me freedom. Yes. The words hung in the quiet morning air. For the first time, Emily realized something important about the man she had married. Daniel Hayes hadn't used her situation to control her. He had protected her from it. Why? She asked softly. Daniel paused before answering. Because I respect you. Emily looked down at the documents again. Half of the largest ranch in the valley now belonged to her. If she wanted, she could sell it, travel, study, anything she had ever dreamed of. Yet strangely, leaving no longer felt like the obvious choice. Later that afternoon, Daniel suggested they ride into town. I need to register the property transfer at the courthouse, he explained. Emily agreed. When they arrived in town together, people immediately noticed. The newly married couple rode side by side through the dusty streets. Curious townspeople watched them pass. Some whispered quietly, others simply stared. When they entered the courthouse, the town clerk nearly dropped his pen after reading the documents. You're transferring half the ranch? He asked in disbelief. Daniel nodded. That's correct. The clerk shook his head slowly. That's the largest property transfer this town has ever seen. Within minutes, news began spreading. By the time Emily and Daniel stepped outside again, people had already gathered nearby. Word had traveled quickly. Daniel Hayes had given his young bride half his fortune. The crowd fell silent as they walked down the courthouse steps. Emily felt dozens of eyes watching them. Finally, someone spoke. Is it true? A rancher asked. Daniel answered calmly. Yes. Gasps spread through the crowd. Emily realized something remarkable. Just yesterday, these same people had whispered that she was being forced into a life she didn't choose. Now they were witnessing something completely different. Daniel hadn't taken her freedom. He had given it back to her. The entire town stood in stunned silence. Emily looked at Daniel. You knew this would shock them. Daniel smiled slightly. I suspected it might. For the first time since their wedding began, Emily felt something new. Trust. And perhaps even the beginning of something deeper. Because the man she had been forced to marry might not be a stranger after all. He might be someone she could truly respect. But the story of their unusual marriage was far from over. Because as the town tried to understand Daniel's shocking gift, Emily herself faced a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The news spread through the town faster than a prairie wildfire. By evening, nearly everyone had heard the unbelievable story. Daniel Hayes, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, had given half of his entire ranch to his 19-year-old bride just one day after their wedding. Inside the small general store, ranchers gathered in tight circles, whispering their opinions. He must be crazy, one man said. No man gives away half his land unless there's a reason, another replied. Across town in the cafe, women leaned across their tables, speaking in hushed voices. Maybe he truly cares about her, someone suggested. But many simply shook their heads. To them, it made no sense. Meanwhile, Emily sat quietly on the wooden porch of the ranch house that evening, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The sky burned with deep shades of orange and red as cattle moved slowly across the distant fields. She held the property documents in her hands again. Half the Hayes ranch now legally belonged to her. The realization still felt unreal. Daniel stepped outside and joined her on the porch. You've been quiet since we returned from town, he said gently. Emily looked up at him. I've just been thinking. Daniel leaned against the wooden railing, gazing across the land. That's understandable. Emily studied his calm expression. Do you realize what you've done? She asked. Daniel nodded. Yes. You trusted me with something people spend their entire lives fighting over. Daniel turned slightly toward her. Land only matters if the people living on it are happy. Emily didn't know how to respond. She had grown up believing wealthy men guarded their property fiercely. Yet Daniel had handed over half of his fortune without hesitation. You barely know me, she said. Daniel gave a small smile. I know enough. Emily looked out toward the fields again. For the first time since my father told me about the marriage agreement, Emily said, I feel like I'm not trapped. That was the point, Daniel replied quietly. The wind moved softly across the valley as night slowly settled over the ranch. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily asked a question she had been holding inside. Why did you never marry before? Daniel was silent for a moment before answering. I spent most of my life building this ranch, he said. By the time I realized I wanted something more, I wasn't sure how to find it. Emily listened carefully. Then why me? She asked again. Daniel looked at her directly. Because when your father came to me asking for help, you didn't beg, you didn't cry, you stood there quietly and faced the situation with dignity. Emily remembered that day clearly. Her father had been desperate. The bank was ready to take their ranch, and the only way to save it was Daniel's offer of marriage. I didn't feel strong that day, she admitted. Daniel shook his head. You were. The conversation lingered between them, slowly dissolving the distance that had existed since their wedding. Over the next few days, Emily began learning more about life on the Hayes Ranch. She rode with Daniel across the fields, watched the cowboys manage the cattle, and even helped Mrs. Boggs' wives. Collins organized the household. The ranch workers gradually became comfortable around her. They discovered that Emily wasn't arrogant or demanding like many wealthy ranch wives might have been. She listened to people. She learned quickly, and most importantly, she treated everyone with kindness. One afternoon, while riding along the eastern fence line with Daniel, they noticed something unusual. Several sections of fence had been damaged. Cattle had begun wandering near the property boundary. Daniel frowned. That shouldn't be happening, he said. They rode closer. The wooden posts had clearly been broken on purpose. This wasn't an accident, Emily said quietly. Daniel nodded. I agree. That evening, Daniel called a meeting with several of his most trusted ranch hands. Tom, the older rancher who had greeted them on their first day, examined the situation carefully. Someone's been cutting through our fences at night, Tom said. Why would they do that? Emily asked. Tom exchanged a glance with Daniel before answering. Some ranchers around here have always been jealous of this land. Daniel remained calm but thoughtful. They may believe causing trouble will weaken the ranch. Emily suddenly understood. Not everyone in the valley admired Daniel Hayes. Some saw his success as something they wanted to take. Over the next few nights, Daniel and several ranch hands began patrolling the property after dark. Emily worried about him, but Daniel insisted it was necessary. This ranch supports dozens of families, he explained. Protecting it is my responsibility. One night, Emily waited on the porch long after sunset. Finally, she saw horses approaching in the distance. Daniel and two ranch hands rode back into the yard. When Daniel dismounted, she immediately noticed the tension in his expression. What happened? She asked. We caught someone cutting the fence, he replied. Who was it? Daniel sighed. A group working for a rancher named Caleb Turner. Emily recognized the name. Turner owned a large property near the southern hills and had long been considered Daniel's biggest competitor. Why would he do that? Emily asked. Daniel looked out toward the dark valley. Because if our cattle wander onto his land, he can claim them. Emily felt anger rising. That's stealing, Daniel nodded. It is. The situation created tension throughout the valley. Rumors spread quickly. Some people believed Turner wanted to provoke Daniel into a conflict that could damage his reputation. Others simply watched to see how the situation would unfold. During this time, Emily remained close to Daniel, helping wherever she could. And something unexpected began happening. Their relationship slowly changed. What had started as a forced arrangement was becoming something real. They laughed together during long rides across the fields. They shared quiet conversations during evening dinners. Emily discovered Daniel had a dry sense of humor hidden beneath his serious personality. Daniel discovered Emily possessed intelligence and determination far beyond her years. One evening, while watching the sunset from the same hill where he had given her the property documents, Emily spoke softly. "You know something strange?" Daniel looked at her. "What?" "If you had never given me that wedding gift, I might have spent years feeling like a prisoner." Daniel waited quietly. "But now," Emily continued, "I stay here because I want to." Daniel didn't immediately respond, but the expression in his eyes revealed how much those words meant to him. Far below them, the lights of the ranch flickered on as night settled across the valley. The Hayes Ranch had faced many challenges before, but with Emily now standing beside him, not as a trapped bride, but as an equal partner, Daniel Hayes knew the future might hold something even greater than success. It might hold something neither of them had expected when the marriage began. The tension between Daniel Hayes and Caleb Turner did not disappear after that night. In fact, it only grew stronger. For weeks, small problems continued appearing along the edges of the Hayes Ranch. Fences were mysteriously damaged again. A few cattle wandered away and were later found grazing near Turner's property. None of it was enough to start a legal battle, but everyone in the valley understood what was happening. Caleb Turner was testing Daniel. Inside the ranch house, Emily sat at the large wooden table, studying maps of the property. Since receiving half ownership of the ranch, she had begun taking her responsibilities seriously. Daniel noticed the maps spread across the table when he walked in. "You're working late," he said. Emily looked up. "I've been thinking about the fence problem." Daniel pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "What did you find?" Emily pointed to several marks she had drawn along the map. "Every damaged fence is along the southern border, closest to Turner's land." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's where his cattle roam." Emily leaned back slightly. "Then maybe we're thinking about this the wrong way." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Instead of just fixing the fences, maybe we should make it impossible for anyone to cut them without being seen." Daniel studied her carefully. "You have an idea?" Emily smiled slightly. "A few." The next morning, the ranch buzzed with unusual activity. Under Emily's direction, several ranch hands began reinforcing the southern fences with thicker wooden posts and stronger wire. But that wasn't the most important part of her plan. Emily also organized rotating patrols throughout the night, placing riders at strategic points along the property line. Tom, the older ranch hand, chuckled as he watched the changes. "Mrs. Hayes runs this place like she's been doing it for 20 years, he told Daniel. Daniel smiled quietly. "I'm starting to think she might be better at it than I am." Over the next several nights, the patrols kept careful watch. And finally, just after midnight on the fourth night, the plan worked. One of the riders spotted movement near the southern fence line. 3 men were trying to cut through the wire under the cover of darkness. Before they could escape, Daniel and several ranch hands rode in and surrounded them. The men were caught. When questioned, they admitted they had been sent by Caleb Turner. By morning, the entire valley knew what had happened. Turner's attempt to sabotage the Hayes Ranch had finally been exposed. But the biggest surprise came when people learned something else. The entire strategy that caught the thieves had been planned by Emily. The 19-year-old bride many had once pitied had just protected one of the largest ranches in the valley. In town, the conversations changed quickly. Inside the general store, ranchers shook their heads in amazement. "That girl's smarter than we thought," one said. Another man laughed. Daniel Hayes might have married the best partner he could ever find. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Caleb Turner was forced to pay heavy damages for the sabotage. His reputation suffered badly. No rancher in the valley trusted him anymore. Back at the Hayes Ranch, life slowly returned to normal. The fences remained secure. The cattle grazed peacefully across the wide green fields. And for the first time in weeks, the valley felt calm again. One evening, Emily and Daniel rode together to the hill overlooking the ranch. It had become their favorite place to talk. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with warm colors. Daniel looked at her thoughtfully. "You handled the Turner situation better than most experienced ranchers would have." Emily laughed softly. "I just didn't want someone destroying the place we've worked so hard to protect." Daniel noticed the way she said we. Not you, we. After a moment of silence, Emily spoke again. "You know, when I first agreed to this marriage, I thought my life was over." Daniel looked down slightly. "I know. But now," Emily continued, "I realize something." "What's that?" he asked. She turned toward him. "You didn't trap me here." Daniel waited quietly. "You gave me a future." The words carried more meaning than any formal declaration. Daniel had always believed love could not be forced. It had to grow naturally. And now, standing beside Emily on the hill, he felt that possibility becoming real. A few days later, the town gathered again near the church for the annual harvest celebration. Families filled the streets with laughter and music. Emily and Daniel arrived together, riding side by side. But this time, the town looked at them differently. No one whispered about a forced marriage anymore. No one pitied the young bride. Instead, people greeted Emily with respect. She had proven herself not just as Daniel Hayes's wife, but as a capable ranch owner in her own right. During the celebration, the town mayor even approached them. "I believe this valley owes Mrs. L. Hayes a great deal of gratitude," he said. Emily blushed slightly. "I only did what anyone would have done," she said. Daniel smiled quietly beside her. Later that evening, as lanterns lit the streets and music filled the air, Emily turned to Daniel. "Do you remember the day you gave me the wedding gift?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I remember. You said it would give me the freedom to leave if I wanted. That was always true." Emily smiled. "Well, I've made my decision." Daniel's expression remained calm, though his heart beat slightly faster. "And what decision is that?" Emily looked out at the town, then back at the valley beyond it. "I'm staying." Daniel waited. "Not because I have to," she continued, "but because this is where I belong." She paused before adding the final words, "And because you're the man I want beside me." For the first time since their unusual marriage began, Daniel Hayes allowed himself a full smile. The townspeople watched, the couple standing together beneath the lantern lights. Many remembered the rumors that had surrounded their wedding. But now, those whispers had been replaced with something else: respect. Because the wedding gift that once shocked the town had done something far greater than anyone expected. It had turned a forced marriage into a true partnership. And that was why, from that day forward, whenever people told the story of Daniel Hayes and his young bride, they always ended it the same way. The Millionaire Cowboy's wedding gift hadn't just silenced the town, it had changed two lives forever.